I was standing on the deck of a chartered boat in Tofino when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Get on a flight tonight. Don't tell your father anything. Bring your passport." I read it 3 times, certain it was a scam, until I noticed it had come through encrypted messaging, the kind my firm used for whistleblower cases. I had spent 11 years as a forensic auditor in Toronto without once suspecting I'd need those skills on my own family. The trip to Tofino had been my stepmother's idea, a reconciliation weekend to celebrate my half-brother's new restaurant chain, securing its first round of investors. I'd been sitting at the end of the table picking at halibut while my stepmother, Pauline, reminded the other guests that I'd been sent to a residential treatment facility in Alberta when I was 11, for behavioral issues, as if that explained why I still flinched every time my father raised his voice. My brother Easton, 26 and golden in the way only a child who'd never been punished can be, laughed and said the family needed someone boring to handle the spreadsheets while he handled vision. I smiled the way I always did. I'd learned a long time ago that flinching only fed them. What none of them knew was that I'd been quietly building a forensic file on our family's finances for 3 years, ever since I noticed a transfer pattern in my late mother's old investment statements that didn't add up. My mother, Astrid, had been a marine biologist who patented a water filtration process before she died when I was 10. The royalties from that patent were supposed to be held in trust for me until I turned 30. I was 31 now, and I had never seen a cent of it. My father, Graham, no, not Graham, I'd renamed him in my head 1,000 times, but everyone in this family still called him Dad like the word meant something, had controlled every account since I was sent away. The official story was that I'd been emotionally unstable after my mother's death, prone to violent outbursts requiring supervision. The truth, as I'd later learn, was a single shoving match between me and Easton over a video game console when I was 11, exaggerated into a court filing by Pauline so convincingly that a judge granted my father guardianship of my trust until I was deemed stable, with reviews every 3 years that somehow never required me to actually appear in court. I texted back the unknown number, "Who is this?" The reply came instantly, "A friend who owes your mother a debt. Check your email. There's a flight at 11:40 from Tofino to Vancouver, then a connection home. Don't sign anything before you talk to me." I excused myself from the table, claiming a work emergency which wasn't entirely a lie. Pauline rolled her eyes and said something about how I never knew how to relax. Easton didn't look up from his phone. My father told me, in that flat voice that had terrified me since childhood, that if I left before the toast for his new business partner, it would reflect poorly on the family. I left anyway. On the flight, I opened the email. It was from a man named Patrick Okonkwo-Reyes, an investigator who'd spent 2 years working a fraud case involving a Calgary family court judge accused of approving guardianship renewals without proper hearings. In exchange for payments routed through numbered companies, my father's name was in his files. So was mine. By the time I landed in Toronto, I had a voicemail from Patrick asking me to meet him somewhere private. We met 2 days later in a back booth of a diner in Scarborough, where he spread out bank records showing that my mother's patent royalties, worth roughly $92 million over 2 decades, had been quietly funneled through holding companies controlled by my father, used to fund Easton's restaurants, Pauline's lake house in Muskoka, and a Cayman account that didn't officially exist anywhere in Canada. I asked him the only question that mattered. How was this legal for 22 years? He told me it wasn't. It had simply never been challenged. Every 3 years, my father's lawyer, a slick estate attorney named Holbrook, filed a renewal of guardianship supported by a psychiatric assessment claiming I remained a danger to myself, assessments I had never actually sat for. And every 3 years, a family court judge named Whitlock signed off without a hearing, in exchange for $50,000 routed to a numbered company in Nevada that, according to corporate records Patrick had pulled, was registered to Whitlock's brother-in-law. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked him what he needed from me. He needed someone on the inside who understood finance well enough to follow the money the rest of the way, because the trail led somewhere he hadn't expected, and he wanted a second set of eyes before he brought it to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. We worked together for 6 weeks, mostly at night, after my regular job, tracing wire transfers and shell companies until we found the detail that changed everything. The most recent $50,000 payment to Whitlock's brother-in-law hadn't come from my father's accounts or Pauline's offshore holdings. It had come from a registered education savings plan, the kind every Canadian parent opens for their kid through a bank, this one belonging to my nephew, Easton's 4-year-old son. I called Easton's wife, Bridget, the only member of that family who had ever treated me like a person and not a problem. I asked her carefully whether she knew anything about her son's RESP. She went quiet on the phone for almost a full minute, then told me she'd noticed a withdrawal 3 months ago, and Easton had told her it was a temporary loan for restaurant overhead, that he'd put it back before the government grant matching deadline. I told her where the money had actually gone. I heard her start to cry, and then I heard something harder settle into her voice, the sound of a person deciding something. Bridget became our second insider. She had access to family financial documents Easton kept at home, things he never thought to hide from his own wife. With her help and Patrick's contacts at the RCMP, we built a case that went well beyond my trust fund. Bribery of a sitting judge, wire fraud, misappropriation of an education savings account meant for a child. Patrick told me the RCMP wanted to move fast before my father realized anything was wrong, which meant I needed to keep playing along at home for a little longer. So when my father called demanding I come back for family business, I went. He and Holbrook had drafted a new document, one designed to formally and permanently sever my claim to my mother's trust, calling it a voluntary relinquishment of beneficiary interest, dressed up in enough legal language to make my eyes glaze over on purpose. My father told me, not asked, that I would sign it at Holbrook's office that Friday, or he would have me declared incompetent permanently and have the whole trust folded into Easton's company instead. I agreed to sign. I even let my voice shake on the phone, let him hear exactly the kind of fear he'd spent 22 years training into me, because I needed him comfortable. I needed him to believe he had already won. Patrick's lawyer, a sharp, soft-spoken litigator named Imogen Castellanos, had a plan. She'd obtained the exact template Holbrook used, down to the letterhead and the notary stamp placement, and reverse-engineered an identical-looking document that did the opposite of what my father intended. Instead of relinquishing my claim, it granted me, as senior beneficiary of a trust under active fraud investigation, full emergency authority over every account and holding company tied to my father's name, the kind of document that could trigger an immediate asset freeze the moment it hit the right desk at the RCMP. She gave me a fountain pen filled with thermal reactive ink that would render my signature on my father's document invisible within 24 hours, leaving him holding a blank, worthless page while I walked out with a fully valid, permanently inked authorization tucked inside my jacket. The day of the signing, I wore an oversized cardigan I'd had since university, let my hands shake for real because the adrenaline alone was enough, and sat across from my father, Pauline, Easton, and Holbrook in a conference room on Bay Street that smelled like leather and money. I begged a little, the way they expected. My father told me I'd always been weak, that I should be grateful he hadn't simply had me committed years ago. I let the tears come, and when I reached for the water glass and let it spill across the table, sending Pauline shrieking back from the splash and Holbrook scrambling for napkins, I had exactly the chaos I needed. I signed my father's document with the disappearing ink, slid Imogen's identical-looking authorization onto Holbrook's notary pad while everyone mopped up water, and signed that one in real ink, permanent and binding. Holbrook stamped it without ever looking down. By the time I left the building, the document in my jacket gave me legal control of everything they thought they'd just taken from me. I went home and slept properly for the first time in years. The takedown happened 48 hours later, at the grand opening of Easton's flagship restaurant in Yorkville, an event he'd financed on credit because his real accounts, like our father's, had quietly gone dry the moment Imogen filed my authorization with the court. He didn't know that yet. He thought it was a banking glitch when his corporate card was declined at the wine supplier that morning. My father thought the same when his card failed at his golf club. Neither of them knew Holbrook had already been arrested that afternoon, his office swarming with RCMP financial crimes investigators carting out hard drives. Because Patrick's case had named him as the architect of the bribery scheme the moment the asset freeze cleared the paperwork. I walked into that restaurant at exactly 8 o'clock in a charcoal suit instead of the cardigan, with Bridget on one side of me and Patrick a step behind, 2 RCMP officers waiting discreetly near the entrance. My father saw me first, and for a moment his face did something I'd never seen it do before, something close to fear. He started toward me, already shouting for someone to call security, already trying to perform outrage for the room full of investors and food bloggers and city councilors holding champagne flutes. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the small stage near the bar where Easton had been about to give his opening remarks, picked up the microphone, and introduced myself the way I introduced myself at every audit. I told the room that the restaurant they were celebrating had been built on 22 years of stolen patent royalties belonging to a woman who could no longer speak for herself, my mother, and that the celebration was, as of that morning, standing on assets currently under federal seizure. I had the documents. Bridget had brought the respec statements. The screen behind the bar, hijacked through the restaurant's own promotional display system that Bridget had access codes for, lit up with the wire transfer records instead of the planned highlight reel. My father grabbed for the folded relinquishment document in his breast pocket, waving it at the room like a shield, telling everyone I was unwell, that I'd already signed away any claim. I asked him gently to go ahead and read the signature out loud. He unfolded it under the stage lights and found nothing there at all. The RCMP officers moved in before he finished processing it. Pauline screamed somewhere near the bar. Easton stood frozen, his restaurant, his investors, his entire curated life dissolving in front of 36 phones already recording. Bridget didn't cry. She walked up beside me, looked at her husband, and told him quietly that she was taking their son and filing for full custody that week, that she had known exactly where that $50,000 went before Easton ever bothered to lie about it to her face. What followed moved the way these things do once the evidence is undeniable. My father and Holbrook were denied bail, the judge citing flight risk given the offshore accounts uncovered in the investigation. Whitlock resigned from the bench within days and was later charged separately. Pauline lost the Muskoka house to seizure within the month. Easton, stripped of credit and capital, lost the restaurant chain to creditors within 2 months, and last I heard was managing a kitchen instead of owning one. The divorce from Bridget finalized quietly that winter. I didn't go to any of the hearings. I'd already said what I needed to say, standing on a small stage in Yorkville with a microphone in my hand. I used the recovered trust to set up an unbreakable education fund for my nephew, the kind no one, not even me, could ever touch or redirect, because I understood better than anyone what it meant to have your future quietly stolen by the people who were supposed to protect it. I bought a house outside the city instead, north toward the escarpment, with big windows and a view of nothing but trees, and one of the Great Lakes catching the light in the distance. On the kitchen counter sits a small framed photo of my mother in her lab, young and laughing, the woman whose work I spent 22 years learning to defend. I make my coffee there most mornings now, and some days I still expect the ground to shift beneath me the way it always did growing up. It never does anymore. I built that on purpose with my own 2 hands, and no one is ever taking it from me again.